My number 4 best chess game of the 1950s is Ossip Bernstein vs. Miguel Najdorf from Montevideo in 1954. These two great players both had extensive careers, but at this point Najdorf was at the height of his career, while Bernstein's greatest successes came in the early 1900s. At the time this game was played, Bernstein was 72 years old. In fact, this tournament was his last great success. He finished second in style as he absolutely crushed Najdorf in this remarkable game. Bernstein opens the game here with pawn to d4, and Najdorf is going to respond with the somewhat unorthodox old Indian defense, seeing d6 and then knight to d7. Now, in the 1950s, hypermodern openings such as the King's Indian defense and the Grunfeld defense were all the rage, and the theory that we now rely on was largely being developed at that time. Openings such as the old Indian defense were also being tested, but this particular opening has some drawbacks that are going to be revealed in this game and are why this opening is not as seen today. Here, after knight d7, we see the natural move pawn to e4, the kind of King's Indian break, pawn to e5, knight f3, g6, and now pawn takes on e5. Of course, against the King's Indian defense, you can also exchange on e5, creating the exchange variation of the King's Indian defense, but it's not considered a very dangerous way for white to play. However, the big difference is that in this case, the knight has already been committed to d7 and is no longer on b8. That means that it's much harder for black to exploit the weakness of the d4 square, and as a result, this variation is much better for white than the traditional exchange variation of the King's Indian defense. After the recapture here on e5, we see bishop e2, pawn to c6, castles, queen to c7, pawn to h3, knight c5, queen c2, knight to h5, rook e1, knight to e6, honing in on this d4 square and the f4 square, certainly very tempting squares if black can get there, but do notice that black has some problems. For example, this bishop has not moved, black has not castled, and this is not the closed position you get in the traditional King's Indian defense. In fact, you already have one massive open line in the center of the board, so black is taking some risk by not developing the pieces at this point in the game. So bishop e3, bishop e7, rook a d1, rook to the open file. All of white's pieces are mobilized now. Castles, bishop f1, knight back to g7, a3, pawn to f5, the traditional King's Indian defense break. I know that we're in an old Indian defense, but this is commonly understood to be the King's Indian defense break, whether it's actually the King's Indian defense opening or other structures. Now, after f5, black is obviously going for an attack here against the white king, and black does have some chances of arranging this. In fact, the best move here for white is bishop h6 so that this bishop doesn't get locked out, and after bishop h6, white has a significant advantage according to the computer. Instead, we get pawn to b4, which seems really natural, pawn to f4 attacking the bishop, and bishop back to c1. This is Bernstein's idea with b4 is, all right, I'm not going to get my bishop locked out because it's going to come around in this way. It's a little bit slow, but the bishop will be amazing there. This certainly pays off in the game tremendously for Bernstein. But in this moment, and only in this moment, there is a chance for Najdorf to get a totally viable position. He has one move. This is the only opportunity he had in the game to get a position that was quite playable and not worse at all. The right move here is knight to g5. The point is to get after this knight here on f3, and by eliminating this knight on f3, you can take control of the d4 square and get a very viable game. For example, knight takes g5, bishop takes g5, knight b1 is the computer recommendation, knight e6, heading for the square, bishop b2 saying, please stick your knight there, I will trade it off as quickly as I can. But then after f3 from black, a good inclusion, g3 and c5, you have enough control over the dark squares to get a very strong position. Black has totally equal chances in this very complex game. However, in the game, after bishop c1, we see bishop to f6 from Najdorf. This move is just too slow. He has some similar ideas. What he wants to do is play g5, h5, g4, and just chase the knight away from the defense of the d4 square. Then he can drop into d4, have an amazing knight, have expanded on the king side with his pawns, and he can create a very serious attack and good winning chances. Of course, Najdorf, being at the height of his chess career, is certainly hoping to get a victory against the much elderly Bernstein, who has not been playing top flight chess for a very, very long time. However, again, bishop f6 is just too slow. The basic problem here is that, again, this is not the closed position you traditionally have in the King's Indian defense. You have an open file in the middle of the board. There's the potential for many more lines to open in White's favor. And as a result, this pawn storm is going to be doomed if Bernstein responds vigorously as he does in the game. He starts with c5, advancing here, carving out the d6 square, which is a nice opportunity he has in the position, also allowing this bishop to come over here and creating some other ideas, as we'll see in a moment. Now g5 here from Najdorf, bishop to c4, king h8, stepping out of the way, unpinning the knight here on e6, and also creating the idea potentially of rook over to g8. He's still very much thinking about the traditional King's Indian defense attack, but of course it's White who's going to break through first. Bishop b2, now pawn to h5, committing to this idea. And this is a great moment to pause your video and figure out how Bernstein played in this position to totally refute Najdorf's setup. Well, you have likely heard it said that a flank attack or a wing attack should be met by a strike in the middle of the board. This game is the perfect illustration of this idea. And Bernstein strikes knight to d5. He sacrifices his knight to absolutely rip open the board. The position is not closed. In fact, it's open and tactical, and all of the stuff that Black normally tries to get away with in a closed King's Indian or Old Indian, Black is not able to get away with here. For example, a king position that has been exposed by the advance of the pawns, a position where his development is lacking, and in a closed position that might be okay, but in the rapidly opening position that we will have on the board, it is absolutely not okay. Now, the knight strike is just too strong. You cannot allow the knight to stay here in the middle of the board. If you move the queen, White is going to have at least knight takes bishop and then bishop takes e5, and everything is crumbling, so you must accept the sacrifice. Pawn takes d5 and pawn takes d5. Look at how the bishops are unleashed. Look at the pressure here on e5. Look at the monster pawns in the middle of the board and the open lines for the rooks and the queen. This position is a dream for any attacking player. You should not need to see the computer evaluation or to calculate deeply in this position to know that White's position is overwhelming. Now, knight to d4, you're trying to clog things up and trade some pieces in the middle of the board. Great idea. Knight takes d4, pawn takes d4, d6, gaining a tempo on the queen and opening up the line for this bishop. Also thinking about rook e7 if this bishop can be eliminated or dealt with. Queen over to d7 and rook takes d4. Boom! A wonderful, wonderful move. Of course, bishop takes d4 is also good, but what really matters is the strength of this bishop, this rook over here. In fact, the rook on d1 in this position is the one that is the piece that White has that is contributing the least to the attack, so you're very happy to take right here with rook takes d4. So Black throws in the move pawn to f3. If you capture that bishop or that rook here on the middle of the board, it's just too strong for White, so Black tries to ignore it for a moment. f3, rook over to e4 here, insisting on rook to e7, which is a crushing idea. In fact, you could have played rook e7 right away, saying, hey, if the bishop takes, and then the pawn takes, and then, okay, I'm attacking here and here, your queen takes, I have rook to d6. What are you doing about the idea of rook h6 and checkmate? The answer is Black isn't doing very much. You must give up huge swaths of material and you still will not be able to save your position. So that was a very clear and decisive way forward for Bernstein. Instead though, after pawn to f3, he plays rook de4, which is also decisive. Now we get queen to f5, the best move, pawn to g4, pushing the queen off of the f5 square. Now h takes, queen back to g6. And an excellent move. Great moment to pause your video and try to find Bernstein's next. Well, the move is the beautiful rook to e8, the only winning move. So Bernstein had to see this before he continued forward with his whole idea, including g4 and his sacrifices. After rook to e8, you can accept the sacrificed queen with queen takes c2, but there is rook takes check, king over, bishop h7 check, and then if the king tries to run up the board, you have rook takes, and it's almost checkmate, not quite because the queen can block, but white is up 2 pawns. They are tremendous pawns, and obviously black is totally stuck in this position. So after rook e8, we see here Najdorf try bishop f5, developing the bishop, unloading an attack here on e8 and trying to trade some pieces. Rook takes a8, offering the queen again, but of course if bishop takes c2, you have rook takes f8 check, and the ideas are similar. Once again, white's position is just overwhelming right here. The pieces can be included with full force against the black king, and white is winning more material and likely mating with no difficulty at all. So after rook takes a8, we see Najdorf try rook takes a8 here, pawn takes f5, and queen h5. There's an idea of a Tubbo style mate here with the queen coming in and then coming into g2. Rook e4, stopping that move. In fact, rook e4 was the only move to win. Queen h3, a still threatening mate down here on the g2 square. Bishop f1, the only move to deal with that. But finally, black has to pay the piper there. No more mate threats. So Najdorf does take here on f5. Rook h4 check, because you can give back some material to exchange pieces. After bishop takes and the king moves over, d7 is creating an inevitable queen right here. White is going to be up a clean piece with 2 monstrous bishops on the board. So after pawn to d7, Najdorf resigned this game. I hope that you've enjoyed this game. A beautiful, beautiful effort from Bernstein, again, 72 years old. A great illustration of the fact that people can play amazing chess at any age, as young as 5 and 6 years old, and players who are in their 70s and 80s can still be playing beautiful attacking chess that we can enjoy. I hope that you've enjoyed the game. If you want to see more of my best chess games of the 1950s, simply click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.